great to see you, man. I've been keeping tabs on you for probably 12, 15 years at this point. You're kind of an early influence on me, and just watching your work ethic and being able to just take a guitar and circumnavigate the world with your meat suit and a guitar. It's very inspiring for me.
Thanks for having me on, Brett. I appreciate it.
You got it, man. Early on, I remember you've been putting out this newsletter for years, which and you have recommendations. I remember you recommended like some of these early films, some of the earliest like videos ever recorded, where it's just somebody putting a camera up in New York City, and you just kind of watch the people get mind blown by witnessing a camera for the first time in like 1899 or whatever. What kind of got you into those? Because I've been in a deep rabbit hole ever since seeing those, and I watch them all the time, like Tokyo 1901 or France 1907.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I am similar to anyone else these days who's connected to technology, where it's like I came across those. YouTube served those up to me at some point, and why the YouTube algorithm, the one that I'm following, served that up to me, I have no idea why. But it's clearly, what's interesting is that's clearly having an effect on us creatively. It's serving up to us certain grist for the creative mill that we wouldn't have otherwise had. And I don't know what to make of that, but that's some of the grist that goes into my mill for sure.
Yeah. What else have you been kind of really into outside of music lately, as far as media, film, maybe stuff that's become influential for you and trickled into music?
I don't read as much as I used to. Number one, because I have a bunch of small kids, and number two, I feel like you read a lot in like your late teens and early 20s, maybe late 20s, and then something about it, at least for me, I kind of drifted away from it. I'm starting to drift back to reading again when I have time. And I just finished a great Mark Twain book on Joan of Arc. It's called Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc. It's kind of a historical fiction, although he based it a lot on historical accounts. So it's supposed to be relatively accurate. And it's from the point of view of her servant. And her scribe, basically, her manservant scribe. And it follows her from childhood all the way up until when she was burned at the stake and all the battles that she won, like the Battle of Orleans. And it's a really fascinating book. Apparently, Mark Twain considered it to be his favorite of all the books that he wrote. So.
Okay, right on. Yeah, I've not read much Mark Twain since my like middle and high school days, but good rec. Thanks, Joe Pug.
Well, I haven't read any Twain since then either. I mean, it was kind of, I liked Twain when I was reading it back in the day, but there was nothing, I didn't go to seek out more. And this book just kind of came across, I think one of my wife's friends at work recommended it to her. And so my wife ordered it, and I did one of those deals where like she ordered the book, it came in the mail, I opened it up and I read the first paragraph. And I was like, sorry, babe, you're not getting this for another month because I just stole it from you. And I'm reading it now.
That's a good feeling when you pick out like the first 2 pages and you know you're going to be into it.
Yes.
I think there's a lot to that because, I mean, man, I buy books all the time, Joe, and I like half of them I've read 3 pages of them. I'm like, I'm not ready for this. Or a lot of stuff is just, to me, and the way the world goes now and how efficient you have to be with the word and concise. Too many writers are too wordy for me, you know? It's just too much. Or when they further explain a sentence with a parentheses sentence at the end, that really irritates me a lot. It's like not necessary. That's why I like Henry Rollins so much. He's like such a concise, precise writer, not even always grammatically correct, but like you just know exactly what he's talking about every single sentence.
Yeah.
Not showing off.
Yeah, I really appreciate that economy of words as well. But it's nice to read older writers to remember that it's not the only way. You know, I think these days, I would say in like the past 30 to 40 years, and certainly any formal training I had in writing, it was always drilled into me like economy of words, economy of words. If you can cut words out, do cut words out, you know. And that's great. And I love reading writing like that. And I love writing myself writing like that. But it's not the only way. It's not, you can have more flowery stuff. You can have stuff that's more complex and longer. And it's fine. It's just a good reminder to read those older writers and say, it's not right or wrong to have an economy of words. It's just a stylistic choice.
Yeah, that's a good point. Do you find like the way people spoke back then, or I struggle with like Shakespeare or almost the use of synonyms. It can be. Do you have any tips for digesting kind of old literature where the cadence and the vocab was so much different?
Well, I think it's important to distinguish between writers who are, you know, long-winded would be a pejorative, so I don't want to use that, who are longer in their descriptions so you kind of separate from them, and then people who are just boring in their writing. Like, I'm sorry, I do never want to hear a sky described in writing. Like, I just don't care about that. You know what I mean? So, but someone can be long-winded, and it's giving you lots of insight into character, into action, into plot development, into philosophy of some kind. And I can stick with it a little bit longer. I do know it can be useful to try a book more than once to get into its particular vernacular. I remember trying to read Moby Dick maybe 10 years ago, and I tried to read it, and I was like, no way, not going to happen. I just don't get it. Then I tried it again several months later. Then I tried it again a year later. And eventually I tried it, and I read the first 2 paragraphs, and something had clicked. It was like I spoke the language. Now I could see in some way my mind had decoded the vernacular. So just because you don't like something the first time you pick it up doesn't mean you shouldn't give it another try.
That's the great thing about physical books, and just like there's something just beautiful too about just having a library wall in your house, you know. It sounds like you've almost gotten more patient as like a reader and a consumer of art and media as you've aged. Would you find that to be true?
I wish that was true. Maybe it's starting to become true now that I'm starting to get back into reading again. It's very interesting. It's kind of hard to disentangle where my lack of attention span and lack of sitting down with longer pieces of work, it's tough to disentangle the causes of that, because at the same time I was getting older, I had more responsibility, I had kids, and I got an iPhone all at the same time, 10 or 15 years ago. So what is the principal cause of it? I would say that getting older and having responsibilities is some of the cause of that, but certainly having a phone is. It's funny. I remember when Twitter first came out. This is how old I am. When Twitter first came out in 2008, 9, 10, whenever that was, and they described what it was to us. They called it microblogging at the time. By the way, that was like the elevator pitch for Twitter. They called it a microblog. And when they gave you the elevator pitch, they said it's a microblog and people can just speak in 140 character increments. Everyone at the time knew that was a bad idea. Like, everyone heard that and was like, this is insane. This is terrible.
Yeah.
Why would you do this? And it did shrink a lot of our attention spans. What's interesting now about that medium, though, is people have figured out how to, with threads and stuff like that, people have really figured out how to make it more than a microblogging site. They've figured out how to make it more long form, because clearly people are craving longer content in that way.
And sorry, I don't even know what threads are, Joe. Is this a thing that it's like a branch of Instagram, or when you say threads, do you mean like all the comments under a tweet?
So on Twitter, you can take one tweet, and by basically replying to yourself, you can have all the subsequent tweets that you have come out be tied to that, so that you won't read any comments in between those. So you can basically read for as long as the author wants to expound, if that makes sense. It's basically a hack to let you write much more than 140 characters at a time.
Gotcha. And like when you had kids, I know you were like, you got going on your music career pretty early. How far into your career were you when you had kids, when you had your first kiddo?
It's funny. I was about 7 or 8 years in, and now I'm 8 or 9 years, 8 years past having kids. So I've been on the road and playing music for as long with kids as I have without.
Okay. And like, what did you have to change? How did you kind of adjust how you went about music after your first kiddo?
I had to get a lot better at business. I had to figure out a lot of things. I had to figure out how to get off the road as much. I was, in 2015, before my son was born, I think I did over 200 shows that year. So I had to figure out how to get off the road. And so to figure out how to get off the road, you got to figure out how to make money that doesn't involve physically going to a nightclub in Tulsa on a Tuesday night to pick up,
That's
you
it.
know, $500 to $1,500. So I just had to spend an immense amount of time figuring that out. And for the most part, I think I have at this point.
Yeah, man. I mean, your biz savvy is, in my opinion, far above average. What were some of the things that moved the needle for you in that transition where you're like, oh, I can make a little more bread from home and not grind so hard?
Just taking a lot of things in house, realizing that if I'm going to be home with kids and watching kids, like, okay, so I can't go to Tulsa to pick up a check, but there are going to be times when kids are sleeping, you know, naps at night, they go to bed early. And I'm going to be at home and I'm going to have an internet connection. So what can I do to work? And so, you know, taking merchandising in-house, taking accounting in-house, just taking a lot of your expenses in-house and doing them yourself because you have the time.
Okay. And when did Patreon come into play? Is that something you use?
I do use that. I do a podcast that we monetize through Patreon, but we're kind of moving away from that now to monetize through a members only section of my website. I'm calling it The Vault, and people can subscribe there. So we're migrating the support from Patreon over to this private site over at joepugmusic.com.
And what was the catalyst for that, getting away from Patreon?
Wanting to have, to be completely honest, man, I just think that the name and the graphic design of that website are both kind of corny. And at the end of the day, you're still selling people a product and you don't want your product to look corny. Patreon, weird name that implies people are doing you a favor and having pity on you in some way. And then the graphic design of the website just looks like something from 1997. You know what I mean? Like it just doesn't, or 2008. It just doesn't look good. So I wanted to bring everything in-house on my own website where I could style it myself, where I could put forward the proposition to people that they weren't necessarily doing me a favor by subscribing, that I have a ton of content that they can consume,
Yeah.
and I'd love to sell it to them and give them a great experience.
I love that, man. I mean, I think that's a thing that all musicians struggle with is like, you know, there's always that kind of desperation in the air because the dollar signs can be so hard to come by. And, you know, you need listeners, you need fandom. But at the end of the day, you're providing a very nice civil service, you know, and I think musicians need to like stick up for themselves a bit more in that regard. And yeah, you know, I'll be less hard on ourselves, you know?
Well, and also make things that people want to buy. I mean, like, and you don't have to pander to do that. You genuinely
Right.
don't. I mean, I'm still making relatively obscure, wordy folk music and making a decent living off of it. So you don't have to pander, but you do have to make stuff that people do like. And you can learn how to do that over time. It's just not fair to just make something, try not to improve it at all, and then just yell at people when they don't buy it. People buy what they like, and they don't buy what they don't like. I mean, you can guilt them into it for a while, but that is not a durable strategy for going forward.
What else have you put in the vaults / Patreon, like outside of music, that you found people to be most receptive to?
Certainly the podcast. I have a podcast called The Working Songwriter, and we've done 250-ish episodes at this point. And I basically paywalled it in a way where like the latest 100 episodes are always available on Spotify and the iTunes store. But if you want anything besides the latest ones, which include like a lot of great interviews with, you know, Steve Earle and the Killers and stuff like that, if you want to stream that or download it, you got to come to my website to do that.
Oh, brilliant, dude. You got a lot of good ideas.
Thanks.
You mentioned the Killers. I was listening to your Spotify. Did you do a collab with Brandon Flowers from the Killers or a co-write? What I noticed he was tagged on one of your tracks.
So I toured with them years ago. I toured with Brandon Flowers years ago. And then when they were making kind of like, over the pandemic, they made like an Americana roots music leaning album called Pressure Machine. And
The Killers or Brandon Flowers?
the Killers.
Okay.
with him being the primary creative force behind it. And so it's this album called Pressure Machine, really cool roots music album from the Killers. And they hired me to play harmonica and some acoustic guitar on that album. So I did that. It came out really cool. It's a really cool, almost concept album that has like a lot of spoken word parts of it between the different songs. It's a very esoteric album for such a huge mainstream band. And then after that, I was making a record called Nation of Heat Revisited, and I wanted some harmony vocals on it. And I called Brandon and basically said, hey, man, I played on your record. Will you play on mine? And he said, yeah. And he sang on it.
Brilliant, man. What was kind of the catalyst early on? I know you were grinding and kind of a circuit guy working and just trying to make things happen on your own steam. I remember hearing about you, I don't know, in 08, 09, but you had like some buzz like through the industry, quote unquote, machine. What was that a label deal? What kind of put you on the map as far as that stuff goes? And you were like doing tours with Steve Earle and all that kind of stuff.
I had a really good agent early on, a guy named Josh Brinkman, who I was with for 12 or 13 years. And he basically took some good press that a manager had gotten for me and parlayed that press into some really great opening tours. So I got to play with Steve Earle. I played with Rhett Miller. From there, I toured with Steve's son, Justin Towns Earle. I did every manner of festival very early on. Everything from the folk festivals like Newport to all the Canadian ones to then some of the more popular, rock festivals like Lollapalooza and Coachella and stuff like that. So it was really, I didn't even have a label deal early on. And it was primarily just driven by this agent who was really motivated into getting me into a lot of great positions to succeed.
Well, big ups to Brinkman. Shout out.
Shout out to Josh.
Did you one of the staple questions of the show is any really weird, notable, soul-crushing shows, experiences, particularly in the early years?
Plenty. Yeah. Lots and lots and lots. It's funny. I'll go a roundabout way of answering your question. So my wife has this theory. I think a lot of women have this theory that, in some ways she can't remember she can't really remember giving birth and how bad it hurt. She can't really remember the first 3 to 6 months with the baby, and how tough that was with the lack of sleep. She would get sick during the pregnancy. So she has a hard time even remembering how sick she would be. So she doesn't remember this really tough year-long period. And her joke is that is some sort of evolutionary mechanism to make her want to have more kids, to block out all the really amazingly tough parts of it. And I came across recently a log that I had made of on notebook paper that I had made of how many people had come to a show, how much money we made in merchandise, how much money we made from the door. And it was incredible. I had blocked out, in the same way that my wife had blocked out childbirth, I had blocked out a swath of 5 years early on where I was making no money. Just absolutely no money. $100 at the door, $75 in merch, and 23 people paid at the door. You know what I mean? So it's not that there was just one soul crushing show. There was 5 years of them, but I've blocked them out in a way. They're not soul crushing to me because I don't let them go on my own personal, permanent record. I've just completely blocked them out in some useful way to me.
There must have been obviously encouraging moments of those shows where you did you realize even in the early days before you were making any real bread, or were you holy shit, I'm actually fucking doing it. I'm driving around in a car on a tour.
Yeah, it happened before that actually, because that is being out on the road or getting shows is that is a symptom of success. It's not the actual kernel of success itself. The kernel of success is being able to walk into a room and play a song and have people pay attention in a very serious way. Because we all go out all the time. And there's some guy in the corner or some gal in the corner of a bar playing on a stick PA and, playing one original song for every 9 covers or whatever. And no one really pays attention. And it is what it is. But I've tried a lot of creative endeavors before striking out as a songwriter, and I never felt any real traction with them. It was really hard to get people's attention. Nobody really cared. And that was fine. But with music, it was very different. When I started playing open mics in Chicago, immediately, even if it was on a very small scale, there was a certain contingent or cohort of people that was very interested in what I was doing musically. And obviously, 15 years later, here I am, and that hasn't, scaled in some way to fame or anything like that, but it's definitely scaled into a living. And it all kind of stems from that original, being 22, 23 years old and being in a bar and being able to play a 3 to 5 minute song that held people's attention.
And then what were some of the arts endeavors you tried before music that didn't really hit?
It was principally playwriting. I went to school for that. I also tried stand-up comedy for a while, which is definitely by far the hardest and scariest art form I've ever tried. I have an immense amount of respect for stand-up comics. I tried that for a summer, maybe longer. I don't know. I probably only did a dozen or 15, open mic spots or something like that, but did give it a try for a couple, for maybe half a year. Not that I know anything about it, but I did it enough to be like, holy shit, this is really hard. I don't want to try to make money this way. This is seems impossible.
The only big pro to that is you don't ever have to sound check, Joe. Comedy seems like a good deal.
Yeah, but then you have the other side of that coin that is terrible with comedy that completely makes it not worth it is the more successful a joke is, the more likely it is that you can never tell it ever again because people don't want to hear a joke again, unless you're Ron White with the tater salad story. That's the only joke I've ever heard that people wanted to hear a greatest hits of. When you write music, people want to hear songs that you wrote 30 years ago.
It's nice. It is nice. Yeah. And I got to imagine comedians get phenomenally more hate mail than musicians just on average.
Yeah, I really don't get that much hate mail as a musician, so I'd have to imagine, yeah.
Do you remember the first piece of hate mail you ever got, or just nasty comments or anything like that early on? Yeah,
I learned pretty early. There's different mediums where they're a lot more likely. So YouTube, very likely place to get really, really nasty comments. It takes someone particularly sociopathic to send you an email from their email address.
Yeah, totally.
So I probably only had about, a dozen or 2 dozen of those over the course of the last 15 years. Because if you think about that, how many steps it takes to actually compose it, find my email address, compose it from your email address, proofread it, hit send, there's so many off ramps before doing something that kind of destructive and sociopathic that I think people usually take the off ramps. But yeah, there's definitely a couple people that you get those messages from, for sure.
Did, going up and doing stand-up comedy and bombing, or maybe you killed, I don't know. I imagine you bombed a few times.
Every time.
How was that? Was that useful for you on stage? Do you feel like you have pretty decent jokes for a musician now between songs?
I guess you can make people laugh during a show, but it's making people laugh as a musician during a concert is the default. People want to, there is a certain tension in the room in between songs, and you can basically say anything that is even just phrased like a joke, and people will laugh. They're primed to laugh. So the default is you say something in between songs and people will laugh, unless you say something that is so egregious and awkward that it makes it not the case. But it's really not that hard to be funny during the show. And a major mistake that a lot of musicians make is people laugh at them during the show in between songs, and so they think that they can be a comedian at that point. And it's like, the relationship between a comic and their audience is completely different. That's adversarial. It's adversarial in the sense that the audience comes to a comedy show and they're like, let's see if you can make me laugh. You know what I mean?
Right.
As opposed to at a concert, like, people are primed for it.
Well said. Yeah. God, I just had a holy shit moment where perhaps everything I've ever said on stage is actually not funny. Maybe I gotta stop talking between songs.
I mean, you do have to have a certain level of charm and nonchalance and lack of awkwardness, because you do want to put people at ease. People want to feel like you're in control. But if you're a performer and you make them feel like that you're in control and everything's going to be okay, they'll laugh at whatever you say, for sure.
Well, yeah, and saying less is always better. I mean, isn't that like an old Buddhist philosophy? And I mean, you're extremely concise with your word economy. So respect for being efficient in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, that is a rule of comedy. I remember when I was doing stand-up, like reading like stupid how-to books about like writing jokes, and they would always stress brevity. They'd always stress, the whatever the punchline is coming at the very end of the sentence, like the latest that you can possibly do it. But I think the books that I was reading were more about were written by like Borscht Belt comics in like the 1960s and 70s. There's actually, I think, one of the greatest stand-up records of all time is that. Have you ever listened to the Woody Allen stand-up comic record?
I haven't, no.
Listen to it, because that's a real economy. So he has a joke in there. I think it's a perfect joke because it's really short and it's fantastic. And he goes, the joke is just this. I don't even think it's 20 words. He goes, "You see this watch? My father, on his deathbed, sold me this watch."
Yeah, that's good. And he has one stand-up album. Is that it?
I think so.
Nice.
It's not. I think it's called Woody Allen Stand-Up Comic. He might have more, but he kind of quit stand-up as soon as he could. He did that to break in. So it's called Woody Allen Stand-Up Comic. It has the famous story on it is called Moose Story. So he tells a story about a moose. It's really good.
And are you a fan of his films as well?
I'm actually not. I've never seen any of his films. I had a teacher in high school who's a really big fan of that stand-up record, and I listened to it a ton back in the day.
Do you go out and see stand-up? Or are you still a big stand-up comedy fan?
I don't go out and see it. I mean, I don't go out at all though. But yeah, I mean, I watch it on YouTube all the time. I'm a huge stand-up guy. Love it.
Who you into now? Who's your greatest hits or favorites?
Definitely Chappelle, number one. Well, my number one all-time still is Pryor, and favorite stand-up album of all time is Live at Sunset. Okay. But Pryor, Chappelle, love Shane Gillis. He's hilarious.
Oh yeah, his latest is unbelievable.
Yeah. That's fantastic. Love Bill Burr. Love them all, man.
You get into Joe List at all?
No, I've seen him popping around, but I nothing has grabbed me yet.
Oh yeah, check him. He's one of my favorites. Some mental health comedy, neuroses comedy, just like loserdom jokes. I think he's one of the greats.
Okay,
it was weird. I just watched him in Madison, and it was like I'd never seen somebody kill so hard in music or comedy like live before. Mm-hmm. It was like witnessing a man at his absolute peak prime. Yeah. And, I went and watched the special, 6 months later on Netflix or YouTube, and it was fine, but I couldn't believe the difference between live and internet.
Maybe they just didn't catch. Did you see the same show? Were they filming the show that you saw, or you saw?
No, it wasn't the same show.
Okay.
Same jokes. Yeah.
That's got to be tough. That's got to be really tough. Because as musicians, we get to, our prime product is a studio album that we get to manipulate to our heart's content or to the budget's, limits, and then put out. For them, they have to put in all this money to record a show, and, chances are it's not going to be the Madison show. You know what I mean? But
yeah.
you crushed
pressure,
in Madison, though, so it's tough.
Yeah, and I'm sure he crushed during the filming. It's just maybe I'd seen it before. I don't know, but any any influences in your life musically that you haven't collaborated with that are like on your bucket list?
Well, yeah. I mean, I'd love to collaborate with any number of people. Well, I don't know actually if it would be collaborate. I don't I don't know that I co-write that well with anybody. I feel like in a lot of ways, just listening to people's music, it's not a collaboration exactly, but it's like a very, very deep influence. Like I've listened to Gillian Welch for 15 or 20 years now, and it's had a profound effect on what I'm able to do now. And I don't even know that it would be appropriate, given the immense and very fortunate opportunity. Like I don't even know that it would be appropriate to do any sort of collaboration there. I don't know that I would get anything else out of that besides what I already have after like 15 or 20 years of like intense listening.
Sure. What about weirdest venues of all time? Has music taken you anywhere really far away, bizarre places you wouldn't think you'd get to play? Estonia, New Zealand, I don't know.
Traveled a lot. I definitely played in New Zealand, in Australia many times. One time I played inside the Arctic Circle in a place called Tromsø, Norway. And I remember telling my Uncle John, rest his soul, he's gone now, but he used to work for the Department of Defense during the Cold War. And I remember when I told him I was there to play a show in his neck of the woods before I went to Tromsø, and he goes, "Where are you going next?" I said, "I'm going to Tromsø." And he said, "Tromsø." He knew it because that's where they would have like American spies meeting Soviet assets way back in the 70s and 80s. It was like this little out of the way town inside the Arctic Circle, very close to Russia. So yeah, I played a gig there 15 years ago.
And what quantifies the Arctic Circle?
I don't know. It's the very most northern part of our planet. I don't know how big it is, but it's the Arctic Circle. You can be inside the Arctic Circle at a certain point in the same way that you could be above or below the equator.
So, yeah, I mean, the population of the Arctic Circle can't be more than, what, a couple thousand?
No, I think it's probably more than that. Here, let's look.
Yeah.
Population Arctic Circle.
Everybody, please, if I had an applause button, give it up to Joe Pug on co-producing the show.
Yeah, no, there's 4 million people inside the Arctic Circle.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah,
cool.
yeah. No, it's not. This wasn't like some backwards town. They had, an airport and indoor plumbing and electricity. Like it was a legit city, but it was just inside the Arctic Circle.
When you said Arctic Circle, I just pictured that Metallica publicity stunt where they went to Antarctica and played to like 9 scientists in a shed, like a science base.
No, so I bet you that would be much more significant to go to Antarctica. Because I think that's what you're talking about right there, where there would just be like population 400 tops. You know what I mean? Norway's
fascinating, man. I mean, they really appreciate singer-songwriter stuff, and like, just I don't know. Have you driven from like Oslo to Bergen? It's just like those wizard roads and those little houses with lawns on top of the roofs, and it's just total Narnia. I think it's the coolest road I've ever seen.
It's wild over there. Yeah, it's Norway does well for itself. You can maintain little houses like that because everyone's getting a royalty from the natural gas.
Yeah, and didn't they just discover that? Like, they're only recently a pretty rich country, hey?
20-ish years ago, I think. Yeah.
Dang, okay. Wow. And where else have you gotten that was pretty bizarre?
I played Australia a lot, and the east coast of Australia is feels a lot like the States in a lot of ways. Some differences, but it's pretty similar. Once you go to the west coast of Australia, you're pretty far out there. So you're out in Perth is the main city, and then just below Perth is Fremantle. I played a gig out there once in the outback at a place called Wave Rock. Played Wave Rock, which is like this naturally occurring stone face that looks like a wave, and it was in the middle of the outback. So you fly, 15 or 16 hours from Los Angeles to the east coast of Australia. Then you fly another 6 hours from the east coast to the west coast to get to Perth. And then we drove 6 hours from there into the outback. So it was, from my house at the time in Austin to get to the gig, it was like, 40 hours of straight traveling. It was just on the other side of the world.
Was it worth it?
No, there was a plague of flies in Wave Rock. So it was covered in flies. It was me and Christian, the tallest man on earth, were the headliners of that. And we played that. And if you ever have him on the podcast, ask him to tell you about the time that there was a plague of flies in Australia. I guarantee you he'll remember it.
That's some apocalyptic biblical shit, Joe Pug.
Yeah, I mean, it was just covered. I say plague of flies because I'm not saying that there was like a lot of flies there. I'm saying that as you walked through the air, you had to physically move them out of the way.
Whoa.
And I'm saying as I played my gig on stage, I swallowed several flies. It was disgusting.
Well, dude, you're probably going to live longer just for playing that show. I got to believe your immune system is pretty jacked.
Oh, I don't know, man. It was an awful experience.
What about how do you kind of maintain a sound mental health being a man who travels around? I imagine you still do a lot of solo traveling. What kind of works for you to kind of keep your mentals in check?
I think if you're going to be a musician on the road, you really have to watch your alcohol intake. Big time. I like drinking. I like knocking them back just as much as anybody else, but you really have to watch out with music because it's so encouraged. It's so available all the time. It's as available on a Monday night as it is on a Saturday night. It's encouraged in some ways. It's free. And as anyone knows, you just can't drink that much and maintain any semblance of physical or mental health. So I'd say throughout my 30s, addressing that and figuring out how to keep that in an appropriate place was probably the single largest contribution to mental health I was able to give myself.
Do you like to have a beverage before you go on stage still, or does that loosen you up or loosen the voice? Or
I stopped doing that about 8 or 9 years ago. So I haven't had a drink before a show in 8 or 9 years. But I was drinking heavily before shows before then, and it was getting to a point where I was like forgetting words. My songs are so lyrically dense that you kind of have to. It takes a lot of concentration, and I was forgetting words, and it was really bad. And it was like, well, I can't keep doing this if I'm going to, I have to remember the freaking words to the song. So I stopped doing that 7 or 8 years ago.
Okay. And what you got any aspirations musically, stuff you want to conquer before, you retire in 100 years?
I don't know. I'm in this really nice place now where I produce my records from home. Now I have a stable of really beautiful and talented world-class musicians that I can call on and hire to play on stuff
Nashville?
all the time. Many of them are in Nashville.
Where are you based?
I'm in Maryland.
Oh, Maryland. Okay.
So yeah, I'm just having people work on stuff remotely all the time. I'm just having a great time right now. I'm able to do so much at home. So much of the music production has the technology has advanced so much that once you just get a few decent mics, you're off to the races and you can make great stuff. So, as far as aspirations go, I just want to release as much stuff as possible. I'm having a great time. It's going to be weird as AI ramps up and we're having to compete constantly with, 1 million AI releases to Spotify every month. That's going to be a bit of a bummer, but I think if you've already got a dedicated audience, you're good to go. If you're the 22-year-old who's just trying to break in, Godspeed. I don't know how you're going to do it, but yeah.
Any predictions for AI and music?
I'll give you the take here. I'll give you a take here that will be, someone will be able to cut this out of context 7 or 8 years from now, or maybe even a year from now. I'll give you a really hot take that will make me look really stupid. Okay. But here's my hot take on AI so far. My hot take on AI so far. I don't see it. I really don't see it yet. Like, I go to use ChatGPT, and I know that the way ChatGPT works is like you have to be adept at using it. So if it's garbage in, garbage out, right? If you give it a garbage prompt, you're going to get garbage out. But apparently all I've been doing with ChatGPT is garbage in, because certainly what I'm getting is garbage out. Like I don't see the usefulness of it yet. Like I do a podcast, okay? And at the start of the podcast, I have a thumbnail biography of every person. So we're talking about like a 300 to 400 word biography of each person that's going to be on the show. So I thought to myself, well, I'll just go to ChatGPT and say, write me a 300 to 400 word biography of this artist so that I don't have to write it. And I got back garbage, absolute unmitigated garbage. So I don't know. I'm not seeing it yet. Like the AI music that I've heard so far, okay, yes, it can do the cute thing where it can, make someone's voice sound like Kanye's voice or Johnny Cash's voice. And okay, that's a nice parlor trick. But the music that it's creating, like I don't see it yet. I can see you using constituent elements of it. I can see going into like an AI generator and saying, I want a snare drum shuffle at 74 BPM with a brighter tone, and a fill every 4 measures. Okay, so I can see something like that coming through, but as far as composing full songs that people find compelling, I don't see it yet. I really don't.
Good. Hope you're right, Joe Pug.
We'll see.
I like your take. What's your home studio rig, if you don't mind sharing?
All Universal Audio stuff. I tried to be cooler than that and hipper than that by, first starting with a lot of preamps and band EQs in like lunchbox stuff, like outboard stuff, a lot of stuff like classic audio products of Illinois I really loved. But then I just figured, because I'm working on a budget, I'm a working artist, I had to go with the most economically efficient that still sounded professional and great. And Universal Audio is just that. You buy yourself an 8 input Apollo from them, and then you spend somewhere between the neighborhood of, $600 to $1,000 on plugins, and you're there, man. Yeah. You are there, man. You have all the preamps you need, all the compressors, all the band EQs. You're there. Universal Audio has changed the game in the last 10 years. They really have.
So if you're making a studio album, Joe, are you kind of recording yourself on an acoustic with a click and then outsourcing the drums and having the drums shipped in from your drummer in Nashville or whatever? What's your process there?
A lot of times it'll be to a click. Sometimes it's not to a click, and I'll just have them play and then bring the drums back in and then play to that. But yeah, I mean, it's really not that different than doing, a regular album, except, there's just a longer walk from the control room to the ISO booth, basically. Okay.
Yeah, and I noticed a little bit of folk punk in some of your songs, particularly the early stuff. Was that genre ever an influence of yours, or were there bands in that world, or did you just like playing the acoustic guitar loud and fast sometimes?
Like punk music. I never got into folk punk, but I did, I was really into Fugazi growing up. I grew up around DC. I loved some of that more pop punk stuff like Rancid. I was a huge fan of And Out Come the Wolves. But no, I never, anyone who would be classified as folk punk, I don't think I ever really listened to.
Okay. Well, right on, man. We've been riffing an almost good 45 minutes. Why don't we play one of your newer tracks at the close out the episode here? Is there something you want to steer people to? Tours, projects, and then, I don't know, pick a song, pick a single.
People can just go to joepugmusic.com. I got a lot of stuff over there. I got 250 episodes of podcasts. I got an archive of cool newsletters for the last 4 or 5 years with recommendations, and I got a lot of music over there. So come on over, and you can play that song, the latest song we have out from the new album called Treasury of Prayers.
Cool. Thanks, Joe. Love your work, man. I appreciate the time, and enjoy the East Coast. I'm sure I'll see you on the road somewhere soon.
Thank you, Brett. I appreciate it.
Much love, my dude.